Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And on behalf of the Wilson Center and Circle Blue, I want to welcome you to the launch of our newest Global Choke Point report, which is looking at the water, energy, food confrontations in India. It's being done in rich multimedia reports online, went live this morning, correct?
Yes.
All right. Even on our website, but also more importantly for all of you, live here at the Woodrow Wilson Center and on webcast. The conversation on Choke Point India is starting here in DC, but the China Environment Forum with the Asia program and the Environmental Change and Security program with Circle Blue will be taking this conversation to India as well in June to dig deeper into into the findings that we've unveiled here. Now, a lot of you might know the Wilson Centers, since you appear to be people from DC. We've been around here since 1968 when we were created by Congress as a memorial to our 28th president. And we've got 20 projects and programs, and I like stressing more this year that we're not some kind of musty, crusty think tank, okay? We were recognized by the Global Think Tank Survey as we were number 10 on the global survey of think tanks in the world, so just know, we're a fun place, and in fact, I think the partnership that we have with Circle Blue is but one example of how the Wilson Center it's not just, again, producing white reports, but packaging good information in a fun way that people can actually use. And so while you maybe know the Wilson Center, you may not know Circle Blue. So Carl, who's the founder and kind of the guy behind the scenes at Circle Blue, is going to tell us a little bit about what Circle Blue is and what the heck Global Choke Point is.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. It's a real great pleasure to be here. And I was thinking back, it was about 10 years ago that I was first here for the Navigating Peace program, which really helped unearth and reveal the strategic implications of water issues around the world, and particularly trans-border issues and all the other interesting things that water means to all of us. So beyond interesting, Global Choke Point is something that Circle of Blue and the Wilson Center created together. And Circle of Blue, we're a team of journalists, scientists, and data experts, and we like to be on the ground. We like to tell the stories, the important stories. We take photographers, we take data researchers, we take great journalists, and we call it the IWT process. I was there. So when we talk about big data, we talk about context, we talk about journalism and storytelling. It's really important to bring the chocolate and the peanut butter together so we actually understand what's happening on the ground. So Global Choke Point is a joint initiative between the Wilson Center and Circle of Blue. We began about 4 years ago when we did a really deep dive into the water, food, energy, food nexus in China. And Jennifer's home turf, really. Mm-hmm. And so it was a really ambitious project. So we really wanted to ask big questions about what is the relationship between water and energy, particularly around coal. And what we revealed was that really China doesn't have enough water to continue mining and processing coal at current rates. So when you look at the strategic implications and global development implications, it's pretty serious. So China has some reckoning ahead as far as its energy and water relationships. So we also host with the Wilson Center roundtables, and we bring people together. So we work in circles. So what we do is we do the reporting, we bring the data together, and then we bring together the stakeholders and say, here's what we found. It's kind of like that Apollo 13 moment. Here are the pieces we put on the table, and now let's figure out how they fit together and also help inform policy and future decisions. So it's fresh information, it's compelling, it's strategic. I think it's really valuable as far as the data goes.
Can we brag? Because we actually have changed some policy stuff in China where there's a recognition now that the water footprint of coal, it was put in the 12th five-year plan for energy development. The Ministry of Water Resources is now looking at, coal. They're regulating the water allocations to coal. And we've catalyzed a lot of Chinese and international organizations to start looking at the water energy, doing work on the water energy nexus. So we're not this ivory tower kind of operation. And then we had this wild and crazy idea that we can do another country.
We can do India. So that's what we're going to hear about today, and we're going to hear more from Keith Schneider, our senior editor. And like I said, we like to work with superheroes in journalism, science, data, and design, and that's what really Circle of Blue is all about, and I think the Wilson Center is all about, is bringing together these big ideas and putting them in the field. So Jennifer, tell us a little bit about Keith and take us into Choke Point, India.
Wait, before we do that, I do want to know, do have to acknowledge the great people who've been supporting the Global Choke Point Initiative over these 4 years. And we've had the Energy Foundation, the China Sustainable Energy Program, Vermont Law School, USAID, Rockefeller Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, Ford, Rockefeller Brother Funds, and Skoll Global Threats Fund. And they were the ones who initially gave us some seed funding to do a scoping in India. And we found out, Keith found out there's a story there. And then we sent him back again, and then another time. Got photos, got good stories. And so, yeah, well, I mean, Keith he's going to start us off today telling us an overview of what we found in India in terms of the water, energy, food confrontation. And after he talks, we're going to have him joined by 2 other India water and energy experts for a moderated discussion led by the Wilson Center's own Michael Kugelman. He's a senior program associate for South and Southeast Asia. And he's also done a considerable amount of work, particularly on water, energy, and food issues in India. And joining Keith is going to be Upmanu Lal and Diego Rodriguez. Upmanu Lal, he's the director of the Columbia Water Center at Columbia University. And in his work, so you got the full bio, but in his work, what I love is that really he looks at the linkages between food, water, energy, urbanization. He's got science people. I mean, we love that you think integrated. And another man who also thinks integrated, who's got the choke, you think choke point, right? And another man who also, I don't know, you probably don't define your work as choke point. He has a great, I love your name. Diego Rodriguez, he's been working the last 7 years as a senior economist at the water unit of the World Bank. And what I love is the name of he's had a task team called Thirsty Energy, which is really, dare I say, diving deep into the water energy nexus issue across a number of countries. And so he's going to come up here when Keith is all done, and they might ask you some hard questions. And your job in the audience, which I know is going to grow in the course of the presentation today, your job out here is to also ask hard questions of Keith and the other speakers. Are you up to the task? Yes. All right. All right. So, any other final notes? All right. We're going to Keith.
For coming.
Thank you so much for coming. And Keith Snyder, it's you.
It's me. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks to the Wilson Center. Glad to have you here. And to those at home in New York and Kentucky and Michigan and other places that may be watching this. This has been a privilege for a journalist to be able to travel the world the way I have been allowed to spend a month in country, in Australia, in India, 9 trips to China, Mongolia, the Arabian Gulf, to see what's happening around the world and as the world confronts this enormous challenge, contest for resources around energy, water, and food in the era of climate change. We at Circle of Blue, and largely because of Carl's incredible ability to both convene and collaborate, raise funds, and then have ideas, we've been able to do this work in a way that few other, perhaps no other news organization on the planet has been able to do it. And the narrative that we are writing is entirely fresh. We've been in the United States. 4 years ago, we did Choke Point US, in which we discovered, among other things, that the North American continent was the scene of this vast, very expensive, very risky, unconventional fuels development around fracking, around tar sands. When we came here 4 years ago at the Wilson Center, we were asked by Senate staffers, by House staffers, by NGOs, why haven't we heard about this? And I said to those folks, you have heard about it, you just heard about it, and you're going to hear a lot more about it. So this work that we've been able to do has been penetrating in a way that great journalism and really good collaboration in the 21st century can produce. We've been to Mexico, where water scarcity is one of the factors in draining the life out of farms, which is producing, joblessness, which is part of the reason that young men are immigrating to the United States. We've been to Australia. We've been to the Arabian Gulf. And this year we took another look at the United States in Choke Point Index, looking at the precarious condition of fresh water in 3 iconic agricultural regions in the United States: the Great Lakes, the Ogallala, and of course California. And last week, the data presentation software and tools that we developed, our data dashboard developed with ClickView. Carl was invited to the White House last week to help launch the White House Climate Data Initiative. So we're seeing the results of our work in a way that is gratifying and important, and we're helping to write this narrative and hopefully inform folks. So today, it's about China. I've been to India. I've been to India now 3 times. Once last year, and once the year before, and once this year. And I was after a story that looks at what are the impediments to India's development economically. What's happening there? How is India going to be able to develop the energy reserves and the energy resources and the energy production practices in order to move the nation from its developing nation status to something that it says it wants to be, which is a Western-like economy? And I started with a story that I'd heard in my early reporting. One of my sources from Bangalore told me that there was this really, really terrible flood in Uttarakhand. Uttarakhand is a northern state, borders China, Himalayan state, and has been one of the centers of India's hydroelectric development. And hydropower is seen by Indian authorities as a go-to technology to help both expand their energy production and diversify it. And I started my reporting in 2003 when the Prime Minister, Vajpayee, announced that India was going to pursue 50,000 megawatts of power over the next 22 years and 162 dams. And digging deeper into this, I learned that 40,000 megawatts of that power and 113 of those dams were planned for the Himalayan states. So here they are, and Uttarakhand is in the middle of it. Now this is where they're building these dams. This is a land of sacred natural resources, sacred religious resources, and enormous treachery. And high up in the Himalayas is this temple, Kedarnath Temple. It's one of the 4 holiest shrines in Hinduism, and it was built 1,200 years ago, sitting below the snow peaks of the Himalayas. This is what Kedarnath has grown to over time as Uttarakhand and India have promoted a pilgrimage, religious shrine tourism economy, which is huge. And this is what those valleys look like. This is the path from Rambara to Kedarnath, where you have to walk about 20K to get there. Very large economy occurred there. Thousands and thousands of people, mostly men, running mules, helping to transport Hindu pilgrims from Rambara to Kedarnath. This is before the flood. This is after the flood. All right, on June 16th and June 17th of 2013, June 16th, a cloudburst dropped a foot of rain on the plateaus above Kedarnath. And the next day, Chabari Lake, which is a glacial lake 1.2 kilometers and about 3,000 meters above Kedarnath, collapsed. The walls collapsed and the lake emptied in 10 minutes. And all that water came down through these narrow valleys and dumped all of this rubble, all this silt, all this mud on every village, every town, and clawed at these hillsides. You'll see this hillside in the back. People escaping from Kedarnath on foot. 25 died as this hillside collapsed, this mudslide. This is Sonprayag. This is the last place, basically, that you can drive to get there, destroyed in this flood. This is the interior of Sonprayag. Nothing but boulders. Bridges were destroyed. 6,000 kilometers of roads were affected. 1,000 were destroyed. This is the kind of roads that we took to get to see these pictures. 5,000 homes and buildings. But my interest, and 30,000 people died according to the Wadi Institute of Himalayan Geology, and 6,000 people died according to the government. 820 people, actually bodies recovered, and some 5,200 estimated to be missing, and that number is based on the compensation claims that were filed with the Uttarakhand government. All right, but it's also been the center of hydro development. So Uttarakhand has been, remember those 40,000 megawatts, 100 plus dams, a third of them were planned for Uchakan, many of them under construction, a couple of them actually finished. And this is what we found when we went there. Here's the dam at Ukund, pretty much gone. The water was racing at the speed of a stampede, carrying with it boulders as big as buses. And it did this kind of damage to this dam. At Vishnuprag, the water overtopped the dam. This is a 60-plus tall meter dam, foot dam, 20-plus meter dam. The waters overtopped it. And on both sides of the dam, rubble filled it. Here's the backwater. This picture was taken in December. The backwater, this is supposed to be their storage lake. It's full of rubble. It took them, we got there 6 months after this dam. After the flood, it took them 6 months just to dig out the back of this dam, all right? In Fatah, a dam washed away, gone. And in Srinagar, this power station was inundated with floodwaters to the extent that the turbines were just seized up with grit and mud. And it delayed the opening of this dam by more than 6 months. This dam did open on March 4th, finally. All right. So let's just do a really quick summary of what we found there. 33 of the 162 proposed in that 2003 initiative were Uchakan dams. 5 of 21 have been commissioned. Of the 21 big dams commissioned in India, 5 of them in this time frame were in Uchakan. 2,384 of the 77,000 plus megawatts were developed in Uchakan. There are 6 dams under construction there, 24 more proposed, and nationally, 292 big hydropower projects are proposed in India. Very ambitious hydropower program. All right, what's happening there? Well, what we found is that the Himalayas are pushing back very hard against India's hydro generating plans. So 186 dams have been built. 150,000 megawatts is the potential that India sees in its hydro generating capacity. That's 4th behind China, Canada, and Brazil. But they're only developing about 1,000 new megawatts of hydropower annually. And that rate is slowing dramatically. So at the current rate of adding hydropower generating capacity, it's going to take India over a century to reach that 150,000 megawatt potential. Why is that happening? Because the Himalayas, if not the most dangerous place, the most treacherous place, the most difficult place to engineer, design, and operate and manage big dams, it's at the top of the list. I can't think of another place, although there are 2 other major hydro developing zones in the United States, in the world. One is British Columbia, and one is the Andes, both sides, the Chilean side and the Amazon side. India's officials that I interviewed in New Delhi after witnessing this insisted that they have no choice, that the need for power is urgent. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that the per capita electric consumption is low, much lower than China is, much lower than the United States. And the generating capacity that they've already developed is very low. So we have about 1,050 gigawatts of generating capacity. We've been succeeded by China. They have about 1,150 gigawatts of generating capacity. India has 277. That's their utility sector and their captive energy sector. So you have a lot of major industries that don't trust how much electricity is being delivered to them. They need a more steady supply, more firm supply, so they're generating their own. About 40 of those gigawatts is captive. But if you look at this chart, you'll see that hydro has almost not moved at all. There's been some help on the renewable energy side, but the big player here is coal. And it's not moving up very fast. About 20,000 megawatts between 2012 and 2013, about 12,000 megawatts over the last decade. To reach 1,000 gigawatts of power under the current rate of increase, to get to 1,000 gigawatts of power in India today will take about 75 years. That's the end of the century. What we learned, and what I learned, is that it's not fast enough to get there. At the end of the century, you're talking about sea level rise, drowning India's coastal cities. You're talking about more droughts in India's prime food growing region. You're talking about more people. India's growing 25 million people a year. Over 30% of world population, annual world population growth is India alone. How in 75 years does India reach 1,000 gigawatts of power? All right, so let me go back. What's happening in India is what I call the confrontation between the maximum power principle and the law of minimum growth. That is, biological systems, all biological systems, seek to achieve maximum growth. And in nations, we do this through a market economy. That's our sort of response to maximum growth. But all biological systems and all economies face the law of minimum growth, right? What is the limiting factor that's going to keep nations from growing economically, from succeeding economically? That's the competition for this energy demand, energy production, economic growth in India. And in many of the nations that we've studied intensively, China, the US, Australia, Mongolia, the Arabian Gulf, it is a serious competition for natural resources, a serious competition for resources. But India is rich in resources, very rich in resources. What we found is a different set of impediments. All right? One is population growth, growing very, very fast, 25 million a year, as I said. About a third of annual world population growth is India alone, right? The next is this bureaucracy, this incredible, suffocating bureaucracy. This picture was taken in 2012 in Punjab Department of Irrigation. So India still is managing much of its government on paper, passed from one desk to the next desk to the next desk. It takes enormous amounts of time to clear simple decision-making in India. India's democracy makes our democracy look well-functioning. Has enormous corruption. So through all phases of Indian society and all dimensions of India's government, enormous corruption. So decisions are made for reasons other than whether they will work or they're effective or they're sound. A third of the power in India is lost or stolen. So even though India is now generating 1 billion kilowatt hours of power in total, less than 700 million kilowatt hours of power reaches homes and businesses. And then they have some really, really inefficient policies for energy and for natural resources. And the one that we took a really hard look at was the policy of free power and free water for India's farmers. What has that done? Well, one thing it's done is it's ended India's knowledge of hunger. India is a nation that's known real hunger. It's ended that. But it's also produced endemic surpluses. When we were there in 2012, 62 million metric tons of grain were stored in government-managed warehouses. That's 60% of India's annual rice crop. And 19% of the electricity that's consumed in India is used in agriculture. One reason that that's happening is because there's pumping. Free water, free electricity in the prime food-growing regions, particularly in the northwest, Punjab and Haryana, have led to this proliferation of pumps. So you see those numbers. In 1960, there were 3,000 electric pumps. In 2013, there were over 20 million pumps. Punjab, 1.3 million pumps, growing 20,000 pumps a year. It's enormous amounts of electricity. And when the pumps go down, they're also powered by diesel generators, right? So if electricity cuts off and the very frequent brownouts and blackouts, diesel pumps will kick in. It's one reason that the imports of diesel fuel are going up. Crop surpluses consume the most water and waste the most energy in India. And then the last impediment to growth is this incredible pursuit of GDP. And because of these various impediments, bureaucracy, corruption, inefficient policy, India's GDP growth has been slowing over time, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. All right, nevertheless, all of this necessary and built-in ferocious pursuit of growth has prompted India to pursue an enormous coal-based power sector, which also uses an enormous amount of water. So this is one of the fairly new plants, coal-based plants in Chhattisgarh. Coal-based power is growing about 10,000 megawatts a year. That's a lot of new plants. 20, 30 new plants are built and seek to open every year now in India. This is one that we saw near Tilda, 1,370 megawatt plant, brand new. And the coal for these plants comes out of places like this. This is the largest open cast coal mine in Asia, run by South Coal Fields Limited, which is the largest affiliate of Coal Limited, which is the largest coal company in the world, which is a government-owned and government-managed company. But it also comes from places like this. This is a box mine in the Jintia Hills in Meghalaya. And when I called Manu for help when we started this project, he suggested that I talk to a contact of his in New Delhi, and that contact sent me to Meghalaya. And Meghalaya is in northeastern India. It's one of the 7 states of northeast India, between Bangladesh and Myanmar. And this is the closest approximation of the Wild West in the United States in 1880 that may exist on the planet. I'm not going to say anything political about this, so I'll go move past that thought. But this is an unregulated, market-based, heavily polluted free-for-all. And miners are sent down these box mines. This mine here is about 200 feet deep. The ladder to get to the bottom is made of tree branches and small tree trunks. And they asked me whether I'd like to go down there. and I politely declined. But these mines are really dangerous. 2 years ago, 12 miners drowned in one of these mines. And this is such a lawless place that those deaths were not reported to anybody for several weeks until sort of word leaked out. And then there was any kind of law enforcement, investigative, health, worker safety response. I mean, it took a senior level court called the National Green Tribunal and some serious investigation and research by the newspaper in Shillong, which is the capital of Meghalaya, to prompt the government to really take a look at this. And now the National Green Tribunal, which is a senior level court that only decides environmental cases, is investigating sort of conditions in these mines and the environmental consequences. But this is a feudal system operating in the modern Indian economy. All of this is by hand. Trucks are loaded by hand. Coal is mined by hand. Coal is transported from the mine into the trucks by hand. And where there's not the box mining, there's this. There's the rat hole mining. And you need to be kind of the size of a third grader to feel comfortable in this mine. And the men that mine in these mines are about the size of 7th graders. Here they are. These are the carts that the miners fill after they've walked a kilometer or more deep, crawled a kilometer more, bent, trudged to the coal face. Takes them an hour to get there. Takes them an hour, these are two-man teams, to mine the coal using steel bars to break the coal out, fill this cart, and then an hour to get back. So, and the coal in this cart is worth about $2. And this is one of those miners. This is very difficult work. So over the course of a day, they may get 3 of those carts out of there, each of them making $2 or $3. That coal then comes to places like this, completely unregulated industrial area in Assam, in Guwahati. This is their steel and chemical part of the city, where the air is so putrid that it matches anything that we can imagine in Delhi or Beijing or Shanghai. And there's no oversight, no regulation, no real management of the health effects of this air. Now, what we learn in India is that jobs are the most important part of the economic infrastructure at the grassroots, at the front lines, at the level that people are living, and the rest can be tolerated if the jobs and the industrial jobs function. But the landscape and the resources are taking a beating because of this in India. So in Meghalaya, the rivers run all kinds of colors. So this is acid mine drainage from the box mines. Further downstream, the acid mine drainage mixes somehow with the waters of the Luka River, forms a sulfate that coats the bottom, so this river actually runs this blue. And it's acidic, so the fish can't exist there. The air pollution is significant, and of course, the lawlessness in Meghalaya is beyond anything that I think we would tolerate in the United States. All right. As part of India's program to expand its generating capacity, of course, it has renewable energy, and it's doing pretty well in renewable energy. It has a 90,000 megawatt potential. Last 5-year plan identified 90,000 megawatts potential for clean energy, and they're close. Almost 30,000 megawatts has been accomplished. One reason of that is solar PV. So India has doubled its solar PV capacity over the last year from 1 gigawatt to 2 gigawatts. 1,000 megawatts to 2,000 megawatts, and this is a solar plant in Rajasthan, which is one of the centers of India's clean energy development. They're doing pretty well with wind, too. Most of the new renewable energy that's being developed in India is with wind, and almost, more than 20,000 megawatts. And it's going up steadily. Biomass, all kinds of biomass, is producing new forms of energy, a little bit cleaner. This is a lawyer, doctor, entrepreneur, Gaurav Jindal, that we met in Raipur in Chhattisgarh last year, who's developing Napier grass as a test for a fast-growing biomass substitute. Rice hulls are one biomass, other pieces, other crop waste, bagasse is another biomass that's used, and Gaurav is seeking to develop this new agronomic capacity for biomass, and it's impressive, but it isn't even close to what India says it wants to do. And this is a really important chart. Let me go through this with you. So in 1950, the U.S. generated and consumed 35 quadrillion BTUs of energy. And it took us 57 years to 2007 to reach our peak at 100 quadrillion BTUs. And we have been starting to come down. And when we were here 4 years ago, the Energy Information Administration of the United States Department of Energy projected that we would need 40% more energy by the middle part of this century, 2035, 2040. 40% more energy in order to satisfy our high consumption, high expense lifestyle. EIA has come way off projection, and we're now looking at 12% increase maybe. If you think about a 40% energy increase, production increase in the United States. That's, at that time, that was 8 million barrels of oil more a day. That was 400 million more tons of coal mined a year, right? That was 400,000 more megawatts of electricity, or 400 new big coal-fired power plant. That was a ton of energy. And I remember coming across those data, and I remember telling Carl, I don't think we can get there. If we're going to get there, we are going to tear this country asunder. I don't think, both ecologically and politically, we're going to be able to do that in the United States of America. Then we went to China, which is doing that, and it's both impressive and very treacherous, very risky. But if you look at China, China was at 30 some odd quadrillion BTUs in 1995. It took them 15 years, right, to get to 100, or 20 years to get to 100. 15 years. They did in 15 years what took us 57 years, and they want to do it again. They want to double again by 2035. Not sure that that's possible, but if there's a country that can do it, they can do it. They will wreck the planet doing it. They are wrecking the planet doing this. And they're putting their own people in enormous health jeopardy. 8-year-olds in Beijing are developing lung cancer. Now look at India. The growth in total energy consumption and production in India is rising very slowly. It's going to take, as I said, 75, 80 years, who knows, to reach the levels of consumption and production of the two nations that India is so busily trying to emulate. Well, they don't have the time to do that. They don't have the time to do that. And it's unclear that they have the capacity to do it. The Himalayas are pushing back. The landscape is being soiled at an unbelievable rate. The water will be, is already, getting to the untenable. It'll be totally unusable by then. The sea level will drown many of their coastal cities. Droughts will affect their food growing region. It's not possible, is my conclusion of this project, this current project, that India can get there. This is what China has done with their enormous GDP, pursuit of GDP and energy growth. But India is this. India is a different place. India is still very rural. Much of it is incredibly beautiful. Still, forest, great. I mean, I rode through a forest in Uttar Pradesh, where there are 2,000 elephants roaming. I mean, there's those kinds of places in India still. India is this, very rural, 600,000 villages, give or take. You guys can help me with that number, but 600,000 villages, which can generate energy on a decentralized system, not a centralized system, which already, is so inefficient. It consumes, wastes 28% of the electricity that goes through it. India is this. This is this beautiful waterfall, the tallest waterfall. It's in Meghalaya. It's east of Shillong. It's gorgeous there. I mean, this is India, and this is India. Small villages, small towns, teeming with people, swarming with people. And this is India, Rajasthan. This is Jaipur in Rajasthan, this beautiful ancient city that's functioning. People live there. They lead good lives there in a different way than they lead them in Beijing and Shanghai. And for India to succeed, in my view, and in the view of the project that we just completed, India has to develop a new sense of what is the good life, which is deep in the culture of India. But building dams in the Himalayas and operating them safely, mining coal in 200-foot deep, incredibly dangerous box mines, in polluting the air the way it's being polluted, in exposing so many of their people to rising seas, is not, in the end, a definition of the good life. And that's what we found in Choke Point, India. So thank you.
Take control, Mike.
Okay, well, thank you, Keith, for that presentation, and also particularly for the images and graphics, which I think really made this discussion so much more vivid. Really tremendous. Speaking for the Asia program at the Wilson Center, it's been a great pleasure to be involved in this Choke Point India project, and my colleague Jennifer Turner deserves much more credit than I do. I think an important point to emphasize here in what we've heard is what really makes this story unique is what we're hearing about India, in fact, unique. In some ways, no. I mean, there are numerous countries in addition to India where natural resource demand falls short of supply, where national governments have obsessions with technology-heavy, big project supply-side policies, where poor demand-side management squanders precious natural resources, where you effectively have heavy subsidy on steroid policies, so to speak, that are nonetheless politically unassailable, and also where renewables have promise yet ultimately don't have the scale to make an impact, and also where there's a lot of bureaucracy, corruption, soaring population growth makes things even more complicated. This is what Circle of Blue has concluded about India, correctly, I think, but in many ways you could say the same about a number of other countries. Pakistan, for example, a country I've looked at a lot in this context, and also in some specific contexts, even the U.S. But for me, what really makes this story of India unique, and what Keith and his Circle of Blue colleagues have very wisely emphasized, are really two things for me. One, as he said, is that India, relatively speaking, does not lack natural resources per se. It has a relatively comfortable supply of water and land. And yet, so long as the policies that Keith has highlighted continue, the supply of these resources can grow ever more perilous. The second thing that I'd highlight in terms of what makes this story so unique, what makes the India story so unique, is how acute and egregious the sheer losses and the wastage of resources are. I mean, natural resources are used inefficiently all over the place in many countries, but in India you really have it happening on such a larger scale than in so many other countries, including in China. And just for a stat that's always struck me, in New Delhi, about a third of fresh water is lost to leakage because of old pipes and pumping stations that aren't in good shape. So I think that's worth highlighting. With that said, what I thought I'd do first of all is just turn to our panel and offer Manu and Diego an opportunity to weigh in, maybe discuss basically their reactions, if there are things they agreed with, disagreed with. Are there things that he should have covered more? So Manu, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll be happy to. I would like to congratulate Keith for really putting together a very compelling story. I haven't been so depressed in a long time. And I've been quite depressed about India for quite some time. So you've actually achieved a high point, I think. There are a few things that I think I would like to add to amplify what Michael just brought up. In some of the work we have done in India, and I suggested to Keith to look into on the water, food, energy nexus, there's a very nice graphic that comes out of the state of Gujarat. You have subsidized agriculture, free electricity, free water, as he was pointing out. The value of the electricity that is being used by the farmer per acre, based on the cost of generation of electricity, not the market value of electricity, actually exceeds the total value of the crop produced by that farmer. Very interesting, right? So this is a graphic-based story. But right underneath, where these people are consuming huge quantities of water, and the groundwater levels have dropped from 5 meters below surface to 300 meters below surface, remarkable. Imagine now you could generate hydropower with a 300-meter head. This is what's sucking it up. Is the second largest coal seam in India. Okay. Now this is harder to extract, but the depressing part of the story that Keith was pointing out was the manner in which these resources are being developed and the human cost associated with it. Because what you could do, and Ray here, while we were waiting, was talking about natural gas being sold from the United States to India. So that's what I'm going to tie this into. You could do in situ gasification of these coal resources and have a much more portable and viable source. Yes, it would use water, but if you look at the water consumption there versus the water consumption for growing wheat, which is not going anywhere, the surplus wheat, it's a dramatic story of public sector, private sector failure to understand where the real opportunities are. I love the idea that India is perhaps doing better in some way than China. It's very hard for me to absorb that idea. But one place where you can look at this is the Olympics, totally shifting gears in a way. China was the leading winner of medals in the Olympics. The United States came in second or third. India won 1 or 2 medals, and that was a highlight. Everyone celebrated. What does this actually reflect in a way? It's not about economic growth, but it is about social and physiological growth and what the country is able to sustain. It's also a country where there are very high education levels, but at the same time, it's impossible to find qualified people to work on anything you actually want them to work on. So that sort of diversity speaks to the degree of income inequality and what that drives in terms of resource use. On the one hand, you have a gentleman who's in the top 10 richest people in the world and has a 20,000 square foot house in Mumbai on the beach. And on the other hand, you have the guy, 6 people working to make less than $6 a day. You cannot have this sort of inequality and expect progress. I would submit that China has inequality, but it doesn't even come close to looking at these kind of things. So this is why I'm depressed. It's an energy story, it's a water waste story, it's a food surplus and waste story, it's a complete mismanagement story, and it's hard to see a turning point. So with that depressing story, maybe I should hand off to Diego.
You want to tell a more positive story, Diego, or no?
Probably more depressing, I guess. But, I'll try. No, I think it was a great, Keith, what you brought in on the to the table in terms of this clear linkages with a water, food, and energy nexus. I think that we have to start probably a bit even more upstream, and it's the whole issue of development, growth, poverty, and inequality. And I think many of the policies that you see or that you showcase today are clearly developed or implemented by these governments with a much more encompassing or much more broader discussion, which is the whole issue of how do you grow? Do you grow sustainably? Do you push very hard like China did into a sustainable growth patterns, but with a clear goal in mind that growth will take a lot of 400 people out of poverty. How do you achieve this massive job creation and keep and sustain that job creation? I think there are questions that go way beyond what we can do in water or in energy or in food. So for me, the question is, when we have these discussions, it's a how. No, I mean, how from our side can we influence the political machinery that is already there? And as you saw, it's institutionalized, the bureaucracy is institutionalized, corruption is institutionalized. How do you change from the behavior from the politicians from a very short-term perspective, which is a current administration period, into a longer-term sustainable pattern? And I think that's a challenge that we face now. And it turns, the issue is, what are the alternatives to all of the things? What are the trade-offs? What are the costs implications? So if we can start showing that obviously the energy issue of coal is not sustainable, then what is the alternative? Obviously, renewables, PV and wind are intermittent resources. We know that we need a massive base load to grow. All industries need a massive base load to grow, and we have to somehow guarantee that. You move into the food aspect, and it's very, very much an unsustainable management system. That goes from inefficient energy use, but also inefficient water use. Water losses in irrigation are huge. Water losses in industry are also high. In urban water supply are also very high. So it's a matter of also starting to curb demands, and increasing efficiencies in these sectors. But what motivates the political system to make these decisions? And I think that for us is a key aspect, and that's what we're trying to do, is to make sure that, first of all, some of these sector planning, sector investment decisions are not taken, by sector, which is the case in all of these countries. All of these countries, they plan their own growth and master plans in isolation. I mean, if you look at even in China, the energy sector plans with the assumption that water will always be there, right? I mean, you need X amount of water. The energy sector is a powerful sector compared to water. Whatever you need, whatever you will get, and that's not necessarily the case when you face some physical constraints. So, how do you ensure that those sectors start looking at in a more integrated planning frameworks, and understand also what are the trade-offs and what are the alternatives? So rather than always coming with a doomsday scenario, we have to ensure that we can come up with credible, cost-efficient solutions that are socially and environmentally sustainable as well. No? So I would stop there.
Yeah, no, those are all good points. Let me pose a question to you, Keith, and to the others, and you should feel free to respond to what they've just said as well. But I mean, essentially, what this comes down to is a very broad question of how do you meet these huge natural resource needs. And a lot of the emphasis here has been on the government side, on what the government has done, rightly or wrongly, these big technology-heavy projects. But what I thought was very interesting is a bit in the presentation and also in some of the previous articles that have come out of Choke Point, India, a lot of these portraits of these entrepreneurs, innovators around India who are focusing more on demand-side stuff, on off-grid, small-scale stuff. So, I mean, I guess the question here is, are there opportunities for... will the private sector continue to play a secondary role to the government when it comes to meeting these demands on a broad macro scale? Are there opportunities for the private sector to scale up, perhaps in time with support from the government? I think ultimately the question I'll put on the table is how, if at all, can the private sector in India cooperate with the government to address all of these dilemmas that flow from this water, energy, food nexus?
That's the question for the planet, That's the central question. How do we do this? I'll try to make this very quick, and then turn it over to policy experts. What I'm seeing as a journalist is that we as human beings are in deep doo-doo. We're in deep doo-doo, and we're in deep doo-doo because the Earth really doesn't care what we do. The Earth is much more powerful than we are. And that realization came to me when I was in Mandakini and Alaknanda valleys, the rivers that flooded and did more damage to the flimsy infrastructure that human beings have erected there than anything I've ever seen as a journalist. And I've covered lots of disasters, both man-made and natural. I'd never seen anything like that, and it made it very clear to me that the Earth is not playing around. The typhoons in the Philippines, the flooding in the United States, drowning of New York, drowning of New Orleans, the droughts that we've had in Texas, the developing serious dire drought that we're seeing in California, in India, this enormous flood, the kinds of steps that they're pursuing, as we said, on GDP growth. The Earth isn't playing around, and until humanity recognized this real risk that we face and that we're now encountering, both politically and economically, in the United States and Western Europe and Asia, we're putting ourselves in harm's way in a way that probably we've never had before. And we're sitting in the capital of intransigence here in Washington today. We have a Congress that, from everything I can see, isn't going to do anything this year. Nothing. We're paying them a lot of money to do nothing. You do that in Circle of Blue, you get bounced out the door if you come to work and you're doing nothing, right? So, I don't know if the private sector, I think the private sector is important, but it's not mainstream in India. What we're doing on clean energy in the United States is not mainstream. And I'm going to finish with one other piece that's come to me very clearly. And I don't want to sound partisan about this at all. It's just what is happening. Every country that I've reported from in Choke Point, China, is essentially influenced by the fossil fuel industry. Australia, China, India, the United States, Mongolia, the Arabian Gulf. The fossil fuel industry, which is intent on making good on the $20 trillion of investment that it has in developing oil, gas, coal, has taken command of these governing structures and are impeding, private sector development or public sector development that would help. The only governing structures that they have not been able to influence as dramatically as they do at the state and federal level are cities, American cities, New York, Washington, Boston, Philadelphia, which, by the way, have become the places that are responding more intently and more successfully to the new market trends of this century, getting greener, better transit, better housing. Some of them have even gotten better public education, safer streets, right? More proximity, more access. On and on. That the governing formula that has worked in cities, which could work in states, which ought to work in a federal government, has not been impeded by the fossil fuel industry at those other levels. So the summary here is that what Circle of Blue is doing, what we've been doing with the Wilson Center, importantly, is to bring the facts and data and a narrative to public attention that says, look, this is serious stuff, and the government is the answer, in my view. We're going to do this as communities, but we need to break through this logjam of who's in charge to make sure that all of the panoply of solutions that are out there, whatever it is, better agronomic practices, more efficiency, more energy efficiency, more clean energy, more transit, whatever it is, those panoply of responses which are ready to be scaled up, actually get scaled up at a pace that meets the risks that are coming at us, and are increasing and are accelerating.
Okay, so I think Keith said something when he was talking earlier, which was quite powerful. He talked about the transparency of the democracy in India. And what I'm going to do in response to Michael's question is pick up on that particular thread and point out that private-public partnerships are probably much more prevalent and effective in India than in any other country in the world, but they just work in a very different way. The example I'll give you is that India has integrated watershed management program from the central government of India. The annual budget of this program is $1.2 billion. If you take the water programs in the United States from the U.S. Geological Survey and add to that the water programs from the Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation, they are smaller than this number. So that's a lot of money that the public sector is putting out. Of course, when you go to see what this has accomplished, it's very hard to find anything. And one of the reasons is that this money flows through a lot of private channels. And not necessarily to water. So that's the nature of the public-private partnership in India. Large transfers of public funds into the private sector and then back from the private sector to government officials. And the way that shows up is, for example, there are actually a lot of regulations. The government is very effective at creating regulations. It's how they are enforced is a different issue. So with regard to hydropower, the example that Keith was giving, building a large dam larger than 5 meters high requires a fairly extensive environmental impact statement, thanks to the World Bank interventions. So how does the system now develop? Lots of private entrepreneurs go in and talk to the government officials who are receptive to a public-private partnership, if you understand what I mean, and tons of small hydropower installations are put in with no regard to looking at necessarily an environmental impact statement, either at the installation or at a larger scale. So there's a proliferation of a particular technology as it goes through. And now, interestingly, there is an exposure to floods. because this particular set of infrastructure has that vulnerability. The pictures Keith showed are for a flood that is probably a 1 in 100-year event, maybe not. You also have the exposure in the Himalayas to earthquakes. It's a tectonically active area. So what we have done with this strange public-private partnership is induced unbridled development of a particular resource strategy with public and private capital with the high exposure which is unmitigated. So what does the government do? They have one of the largest natural hazards relief programs in terms of money that is available. So now there will be another capital transfer once these things happen back to the individuals who are affected. It's remarkable. So if you want to turn it around, one of the ways you have to think about it in your head is how taking these very large sums of public money that are available, if you're a private entrepreneur, where your options are, and people in India are experts at this. They're brilliant at it. So, that's sort of the context in which I think one has to think about it, and in terms of the transformation. The example also, this is my last point, sorry I'm talking too long. One of the examples that was really graphic for me when we first started getting involved in India about 10 years ago was the subsidy programs, the Green Revolution coupled to the subsidy programs. And the conclusion I came to was the government programs in India are amazingly effective. If you put money on the table, the pickup is fantastic. You can move the entire direction of the country towards what you set up. So the government of India is the largest contract farming operation in the world. It's amazingly successful. It's got the largest public food distribution program in the world, also amazingly successful at some level, but completely unmanaged on both sides. So that's where the calamity comes into these programs, and we have to think about how one can bang these people into thinking better on that.
I think there are huge opportunities for the private sector in these environments. The issue, we work very closely now on thirsty energy with some of the big energy companies, for example, and there are, I think, three basic elements that you see when you start engaging with the private sector. The first one is obviously the enabling environment, the conditions, the fact that you have proper regulations, proper legal frameworks, but that they are applied and they are respected, and there is a certain level of stability in the contracts and stability. And the private sector they cannot address risks in a 25-year contract if they come 3 years after you invest. So you have to make sure that environment is in place. The second one, I think, that you're seeing more and more stemming from the private sector is that in many cases where you go and invest, there are many risks that are not properly considered by many of these private entities. I mean, if you look again at some of the sector-based investments by the private sector, they may overlook the risks in other competing sectors. In water, that is quite clear. I mean, if you're going to build a coal power plant or a solar power plant in a particular region, the understanding of the potential physical constraints, administrative constraints, political constraints, social aspects in terms of competition for that same unit of water in other sectors, you'll be surprised, but we are finding that it's not necessarily very well addressed. So the government or the public side, even the institutions like us, have a very good role in basically demonstrating and putting on the table what are the real risks, how complex these risks are. I mean, if you look at now the whole issue of variability and change, how these shifting patterns, I mean, the main issue with water is, in many of these economic sectors, is not the mean average annual flow that you have. It's what happens with the extremes, right? And what happens, and that brings me to my third point, is how do you demonstrate that into financial terms for the private sector? What are your losses if you have to shut down your power plant for 2 weeks? Millions, because you probably have to import, much more expensive oil from somewhere else, right, or fuel. So how do you gain by actually taking into consideration water, so you can have a long-term financially sustainable plan and avoid some of these financial losses. And I think that's the language of the private sector: risks and financial gains or financial losses, and understanding what are the social and environmental ramifications of not taking that into account in a more longer term perspective.
Are there other countries that India can look to? India has clearly sought to emulate the national policies that China has undertaken, that the West has as well. But as we've discussed, these are very different cases. So the question is, are there other models elsewhere? I myself can't really think of any other country that would be appropriate in this context, but just wondering if any of you have any thoughts on where the country can look, perhaps, in terms of other countries.
So my thought about this is India should look to itself. It has, a rich culture. It has hardworking people. In all of this travel that I've done, it's the country that's most elegant to me as a visitor and as a journalist. That the way. It's almost as if India is seeking to operate outside of itself the way it's operating now. It's not really operating within its own comfort zone. I mean, India's about, forgive me, Manu, but India's about kind of just doing, Indians are great at being able to adjust to any condition. If that flood that I saw in Uttarakhand had occurred in the United States, it would have caused mass panic and disruption at every level for as long as you could think about it to Americans, because we're much more brittle. But it's kind of the way it was in the Himalayas, and this is going to go on for probably years, because those rivers have so many boulders, so much stuff in them. They raise the riverbeds, so every monsoon is going to cause damage just on its own. For years, the roads, the infrastructure, all of that is in peril for years now. But Indians, you talk to people, well, this is the way we kind of do our thing, and we can get by. And so, why take that very flexible culture and capacity to adjust and try to impose upon this very rigorous, energy-intensive, expensive, polluting Western-style development? It's a mismatch that's now becoming clear that India cannot. Those two thoughts are not converging well. They're not marrying each other very well. So India needs to figure out, Indians, not the government, because the government is focused on this pursuit of this Western-style development. Why? There's a lot of money in it. There's just a ton of money in it. People are getting rich. They got all this infrastructure, government, and regulation. But Indians need to say, look, this is not working.
Interesting. Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, so that's a very uplifting perspective. Thanks. I was going to say something similar, but it actually comes back to the India of 2,000 years ago, in a way. Because the two countries I would suggest India look at are really both very small, but both have models that I think people in India can learn from. And the countries are South Korea and Bhutan. So they're completely different ends of the spectrum. South Korea is being emulated by many countries, particularly in Latin America now. And the point that they have demonstrated is that if you stick with an agricultural economy, you are stuck in a poverty trap. And you need to figure out how you achieve a sustainable, modern industrial economy while at the same time respecting resources. So I can elaborate on that, but I'll just leave it with that particular statement. I guess what that statement speaks to is that you have a finite set of resources and you do want economic development, and how most effectively can you do it? And that's the South Korean example. The Bhutan example is interesting because it's the land of eternal happiness. But if you think about it, the king, when he was 24, rejected a World Bank offer for increasing their GDP and said, I'm interested in happiness, I'm not interested in GDP. But what he effectively did was following cultural principles that are endemic to the region. He said, okay, we will allow India to build a few hydropower plants, and the income that we get from that will satisfy all the cultural goals that I want to set for myself. And that's sort of what they accomplished. And now they want to do, those kind of things again. Has it been a complete success story? Their per capita income and GDP is now double that of India. So, as far as that kind of goal goes, it gets there. But, and there are some ill effects socially also, but overall it speaks to the principles of living with the place and figuring out what's the good thing to do. So in a way it is the same example as South Korea, but more closely rooted to tradition than what South Korea has done.
I would put my Latin American t-shirt and would say probably, I mean, it depends on the for what, but if I look at places like Chile or Brazil, I think they're very good examples of places where there has been quite a steady growth, extremely positive and good social policies. So it's about how do you make those resources that are publicly available work more effectively and efficiently. So the whole issue of understanding your public expenditures and how they can be improved into more targeted social policies, I think is a very good example of that. Agricultural diversification, improvements in irrigation, diversifying the economy into other sectors in which they have obviously a comparative advantage. The case of Chile, that you see how they are managing sort of the hydropower capacities in the Andes. I think there are places where you can probably learn quite a lot.
Okay. I think maybe we'll open things up to the audience now, but before I do that, I think it's important because it's happening so soon and probably on everyone's mind to make a comment about the election happening in India next week. I mean, a number of polls have shown that the Indian public considers natural resource management, natural resource policies as a very important issue. I'd argue these types of conversations we're having today have not figured very prominently on the campaign trail, though it should be noted that one of the new political stars in India, Arvind Kejriwal, has been a water activist in the past, and he's built campaigns in New Delhi around very populist causes, such as ensuring water for all. And then on the other hand, you have a very possible next Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, who comes from a state, Gujarat, that is, I believe, in one of the only states in India that's implemented programs that do things such as requiring farmers to start paying for water in certain contexts. So, but on the face of it, I don't necessarily think that whoever wins the election, whatever the new government is, it'll make any sort of major change or any difference in terms of the things that we've been discussing today. Though others should feel free to chip in if they like. So. We should have 2 microphones on either side of the room, and since we're webcasting this, we want to make sure that everyone hears you that's not in this room. So if you could wait until the microphone's in front of you, then when you could give your affiliation, your name, and your brief question, and you could also specify who you want to answer the question. So let's start right here.
James Sang, retired. Professor Lal mentioned the word 100-year flood, and Keith mentioned the word monsoon, which the June 16th, 17th date of the Uttarakhand flood suggests is monsoon-related. Has the Indian government looked into what kind of stresses this hydro system will undergo if, in fact, with climate change and the like, you have more extreme events and monsoons get more erratic and more variable? How would this affect their policies?
The Indian Supreme Court, in a unrelated case or related case in Srinagar, intervened after this flood and closed down, shut down essentially any more new hydro development in Uttarakhand and ordered the Ministry of Environment and Forests, which is the central government chief regulatory agency, to form a commission and to answer some serious questions like that. Also, the effect of the excavation and the muck that's left on the rivers, whether the dams in Uchacan magnify the effects of the flood. The National Green Tribunal also was involved. And in terms of this 100-year flood, I heard that too in New Delhi, and then went to look, and it wasn't a 100-year flood. The hydrological measurements show that it was an earlier monsoon, but the amount of rain that fell was not that unusual. Plus, we found two incidents of floods like this that washed out 2 dams in Nepal in the 80s. 2 dams in Bhutan got washed out by one of these floods, and interviewed opponents of dam construction in Assam and Guwahati, who told me that 2 dams had washed out there. Very little of this has been publicly reported. This Uchacan flood made almost no news in the West, and certainly none of the kind of intensive reporting that we just unveiled here about the effect on hydro development. Is the Indian government going to take a look at the relationship between changing hydrological cycles and dam development? If the Ministry of Environment and Forests does its job, that commission does its job, that's essential to looking at this. Otherwise, there is this very significant risk of these dams being washed out in the future because the hydrological cycles are changing in the Himalayas. That mountains, in my reporting, the scientists that I'm talking are not going to accept these projects unless the engineering and the construction and the design changes, which raises the costs, which make the price of the electricity change. So they have a very serious strategic policy question in front of them. At the same time that all this is going on, I was able to identify more than a dozen new dams, big dams, that have either received clearances or are proceeding with construction across those 5 Himalayan states. One of them is a dam that was started in 2007, the Kinchinkonga Dam, 330 megawatts, that flows on a river that comes out of Jammu and Kashmir in northwestern India, that influences a very important river in Pakistan. So Pakistan and India are at odds about water flow from this river. The Hague, Pakistan brought a case about water flow into Pakistan involving this very dam, and the Hague last year ruled that India is only entitled to a very small share of that water. And that's happening now all along the Indian Himalayan front with China, with the dam development in the Himalayas, because Bhutan, Pakistan, Nepal, India, and China are really seeking to make the Himalayas the Saudi Arabia of hydroelectric power generation. Well, the diplomatic, geopolitical, ecological consequences of that are profound, and I was not able to penetrate China's news blackout to see what dams have been lost on the Chinese side of the Himalayan border, right, of the Himalayan mountains. But I suspect that they've had some really terrible catastrophes there involving dams as well. We just don't know about them.
Yes, Ray.
Ray Vickery from Albright Stonebridge. Well, I want to make Dr. Lal feel a little better. I don't think you ought to be so depressed about a country that, going to Michael's example of the election, will, in the following month, pull off the largest endeavor in human history of human organization every time it has an election. I dare say that neither China nor the U.S. Has the organizational or political will to be able to accomplish such a feat. Now, that doesn't transfer immediately into being able to attack the kind of problem we're looking at here today, but I think it is a reason for hope in that regard. Also, I think it's necessary to take a little longer view. Columbus went west because he didn't want to go to China, or he didn't want to go to Japan. He wanted to go to India. The reason he wanted to go to India is because it was the richest place in the known world at that time. And that was only like 500 years ago. I first went to India in 1964 and 65, and I can tell you, as you, Dr. Lal, know, it's a completely different place. It's not going to be the case that India is going to follow a Bhutan model. There are elements that it will adopt and of its own culture that can ameliorate some of the excesses. But like people everywhere, people of India are going to demand modern standards in, as they have in food, which is a great success story. And we could come back to that, but in food, healthcare, across the board, it's going to have. And so the real question is, how do you do it, and what are the inflection points? And I think Keith has identified those problems very eloquently, and they're pretty well known. I do think that the idea that somehow government has to take over and do more in the Indian context is just wrong. All you have to do is look at coal India, and you see that it's a disaster in terms of being able to move forward. Now, it may be that the unregulated private mines are even worse, but the answer is strong public-private partnership and market-based solutions, as opposed to the kind of subsidies and reliance on the government which have become endemic. Corruption, no doubt, is a key across the board. And Michael mentioned Arvind Kejriwal, who's done well with his Aam Aadmi Party. And that is, it seems to me, another reason for optimism. And it has to be applied across the board in matters of environmental concern. Lastly, it just seems to me that the technological skill of India can be applied in these environmental trade-offs between water, food, and energy, just as it has really shown the world that it can be a primary factor in regard to information technology. There is no greater pool of scientific and brain power that is found in India. And the question is, how do you focus it and bring it to bear on public policy? So I would hope that the panel might take a view, and I would like to hear more about what you view as inflection points. I think energy is an inflection point. I think a combination in terms of gas, solar, and wind, and moving away from the subsidized coal, and as you rightly point out, Keith, the disastrous hydroelectric experience can be the way to go. But I'd like to hear from the panel a little bit more in terms of solutions, as opposed to things which drive us deeper into depression.
Who wants to take that?
I can take a crack at that. I was depressed by Keith's presentation, but really, the thing you have to keep in mind, and I think Diego was emphasizing this, is that to a great extent, the success of private entrepreneurship in this kind of a situation is parametric to the conditions the government puts before it, and you can't escape that. The success of IT, for example, is contingent on the fact that you could not move to a manufacturing economy because you did not have the energy available. That's the distinction with respect to China. So you choose the IT direction because you can, as a private entrepreneur, move in that direction without much penalty. In the energy sector, which is a good inflection point, and with water, I can see very easily accomplishing 20 to 30% improvement from the conservation side and effectiveness side, but not more than that. So you have to look at how you're going to generate these resources. The renewables, I think, have to be the primary thrust coming from India. They are developable. That is where, at the small scale, the private capital can actually have a strong influence. So that's a good story. In terms of distributed infrastructure, Diego's point there was these are intermittent sources, so you have to come up with a way to manage a smart grid. Unfortunately, that brings you back to the government platform. In India, it is now legal to generate energy, but not to transport energy. Okay? So that's where the challenge comes in. On the water side, I think the private sector's influence could come in a very strong way. We have made these recommendations to the government of India again, because again, it's parametric to what can be done there. So let's say that you offer to the private sector water credits. Okay, how can they avail of these water credits? The current policy in the government of India is, if you will capture as a private corporation X amount of rainwater and inject it into the ground, you will be allowed to withdraw it again into the future. This is stupid. It doesn't really accomplish much. What they really need to do is, if you can demonstrate in the agricultural sector that you have stimulated conservation, 90% of the water consumption in India goes to agriculture at 10% efficiency. So if you could get 10% more out of it, you have generated as much water for the economy as the rest of it. That's where the water credit needs to be targeted. Do they listen? That's another question. Now, if you take this water that's generated and you apply that to coal gasification, in situ that I was saying, that generates a tremendous amount of natural gas, a much cleaner fuel that could then stimulate the economy. So those, I think, on the water, energy, food side are some points of action that are public and private points of action that could solve this.
Okay, yeah. Question in the back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Agron Ali Bale. I'm a fellow here. A quick question to Mr. Schneider. You mentioned the India-Pakistani dispute that went before, I believe, the International Court of Justice last year. Could you expand a little bit more on that, to the extent whether or not it's relevant to the Bangladeshi situation, being a country that could be affected by northern eastern Indian developments that you mentioned?
My response to this is going to be pretty limited. I don't know how it applies to the Bangladeshis. I don't know at all about what's happening in Bangladesh. And the Pakistani case was filed by Pakistan in 2011, so it took two years to decide the case. And India hasn't yet said what it means for, capacity generation on that river, whether they'll abide by the court ruling, right? And we all know that, the relations between India and Pakistan are tight in any case. But what I'm interested about that case is how emblematic it is of the cross-border contest for water, for hydro development in that region. Maybe you guys
Anyone
know
else
about the
interested?
Bangladesh. Do you know about the Bangladesh?
Not the Bangladesh context, no. Okay, that's fine. Okay, question. Let's go to this side of the room. Jennifer.
Just to interject briefly, when we did our choke point China reporting, and we went to China, and Keith and Carl, my former assistant, and I, we gave 17 presentations in 3 cities in 2 weeks, and we also got a lot of the response that people said it's gloom and doom, and we said no, we're just highlighting this this issue that no one has looked at. And what we've seen in China, and this is kind of my question to all of you up here, is that in China we've seen how the water sector folks are now looking at energy, and the energy folks acknowledge that maybe water is a bit constrained, and that so we've tried to be this kind of matchmaker. It's like a Reese's peanut butter cup, right? We're trying to get the water and energy people to talk to each other. So just to interject a bit of optimism that that we've seen in China, because we are going to go to India. We're going to take, Keith is going to be paraded around again, giving talks with Michael about our choke point stuff. Do you think that will there be receptivity in India as well? I mean, I think Keith has, people gave you data, they gave you information. So just kind of, to inject a little optimism about the potential of choke point being a way to also move forward.
Well, the thing about China is it's not a democracy. It's a command and control operating system in which if you get in the way, you get run over. The other thing that I've learned in my work is democracy is really not, the governing system that can respond at the pace that we need to respond to either installing new technology or changing practices or heeding warnings. I wrote a piece for us yesterday about humanity's capacity to respond to warning based on the mudslide in Washington State, where we got to the whole cavalcade of how you report these kinds of disasters, and it became like there were warnings. And I noted to my mother who brought this up, I said, well, okay, think about how a warning in that mudslide disaster would have been received by the people living at the foot of the slope. They'd have been horrified at public officials who had seeking to change rules, land use rules, to prevent, block, or react to that hazard. Why? Because their property values would have sunk. There was no science to support the fact that landslide would actually be that big, even though it had slipped in 2006, right? There was no warning. And it slipped, and it was just a little bit, so go away, you public officials who are trying to warn us about this hazard, until there was a disaster. Well, elevate that to the kinds of things we're talking about here, or to climate change, or to the drought, or to the drowning of New York, or to the drowning of New Orleans. How many warnings do we need? Well, what we've learned as human beings, especially in a democracy, is it takes a lot for us to respond to warnings that mean we have to change significantly. If a warning is issued that involves a significant change in our operating systems and style, we'll live with that warning. If a warning involves a small change, an insignificant change, we'll respond to it. So, we have organic agriculture that's kind of a pretty easy response to the threat, the risk, unknown, and infinitesimal, in my view, of a part per trillion of some chlorinated compound on your vegetables, right? That's an easy change. So we will respond to the potential of catastrophic risks or really serious risks if it involves this is change. We respond to warnings to change that you can believe in, But change that's really necessary, forget it. We're not going to respond very quickly. And how do we solve that? Just human response to warnings, because our lives are built on securing ourselves from change. We don't like to change. We have homes and businesses and families and communities and places in our own lives. We build them to secure them against risk. And so when we're facing a risk, are we really ready to move? Are we really ready to make those kinds of big, big changes? Well, this era of climate change, this era of pollution, this era of land use, this era of drought, this era of food, energy, water contest, this contest is going to require real significant change in how we operate, in where we live, the kinds of energy systems we use, in how we operate this nation, how we operate our lives. Why? As the Himalayan flood showed me, the earth doesn't care. Right? Because it is really dangerous what's happening. People are getting hurt, economies are getting buffeted, GDPs are going down, our political systems, Washington at the state, this is a response, are like frozen, solid. What do we do? Well, we're going to do nothing. Well, that's no answer. See what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So that's a long-winded answer to this.
Where's the optimism?
I'm not that optimistic. Really, I'm not that optimistic until we, as people, recognize this risk. As journalists, we have a responsibility. We're doing everything we can to let people know without a storm and drang about this is serious. But people have to recognize this risk. This is serious, serious stuff. You know, if you're in a city, I grew up in New York City, or outside New York City. And for a good long time when I was a young person, New York City was a dangerous place. So how did people respond to that risk? One, they didn't establish their businesses there, and two, they moved. Well, New York is not a dangerous place anymore. New York is a thriving, wonderful place, and people are flocking there. So people have the capacity to change to respond to risk. Well, so I don't think we as a species have a death wish. I really don't. I think we're going to wake up here, and when we break through, it's going to happen fast, particularly in this country. We have the capacity in the United States to move very quickly to perceived risk. But we do that when we see it as a military risk in most cases. Well, this is a military-like risk that we need to respond to with a kind of, national development strategy, energy to respond. And until we see this in its serious military-like dimensions, we need to respond that way, and we're not. Until we do that, we're going to be buffeted, and people are getting hurt out here.
And I should point out that some of the most climate-vulnerable countries in the militaries have actually taken a lead in planning for contingencies. Bangladesh, for example, has taken a big lead. I'm sure that India and others have as well. All right, do we have any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name is Kiera Hall, and I'm a representative from the Chiang Mai Organization for Rural Development at American University. And in our organization, we believe that, or we strive to provide support and kind of development strategies at the local level for primarily women and children in rural towns. And I was wondering if you had any insights. Dr. Schneider, Mr. Schneider, I was really taken by what you said, that the true development will have to come from the Indian people rather than the roads that are being taken by their government. And I was wondering if you had any more insights about things that have worked at the grassroots level in terms of encouraging development, and particularly with women and children.
We were in Chhattisgarh in 2012 and visited a village there that had a serious water scarcity problem, mostly the result of drainage of their groundwater. And they had worked with an NGO and women engineers, and the women were involved in the village response to that. And what they did was build 37 check dams, essentially, to slow the monsoons, have it soak in the water, which raised the groundwater, which reduced their pumping. Very elegant and very cost-effective. But rare. Rare. Too rare. Not mainstream enough. Women, where I encountered women when we were there 2 years ago was, of course, how poorly women are treated in India and how poorly little girls are treated in India. And both of those issues came to the fore in late 2012 following a terrible, terrible crime in Delhi. And you have a sense that the culture has reached an inflection point on the issue of how Indian society is going to be treating women, particularly young women. I met many, 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 many highly trained women that in places, in positions of great authority and influence. But they treated me in a way that's different than you're treated by women in China or women in the United States or women in Mongolia. I don't have any specific, grassroots experiences with women in India. Maybe you guys can help on that.
With women specifically, in a way, one of the answers is that there is a macro level question that Keith raised to begin with, and you're asking a micro level question as to what can be done, and what's the bridge between the two is the issue. On the women issue, India's had a female prime minister. The United States has yet to have a woman president, and the point I want to make with that is India is not one country. It's a whole set of different groups that coexist somehow. So if you look at women who are coming from, say, an intellectual class, their accomplishments are probably superior to the men coming from the same groups. Whereas if you go to the rural setting, one of the things that we've tried to promote in India is to see if in the rural setting, women are now educated up to high school, but post that they're not, and what we have tried to do is, as the microcredit industry has grown in India, to see if the role of the women in the household is to become the financial manager of the household, the investments on which seeds to buy, what kind of practices to do. And we've tried to propagate this out, which is one of the ways an NGO could help. And what you see is a nice transformation that comes from that, because suddenly if the woman becomes the financial manager in the household, their status changes immediately. And that's one of the things we have seen, which may be beneficial.
This invites a comment from me that is sort of tangentially related to what you're talking about, but it affects the whole country. Indians have a very significant concern about their megafauna, their big cats, their elephants, their rhinoceroses. And if India treated its people and its workers the way it requires transporters to treat a female elephant that's moving from one place to another, the country would be a lot better off. And by that I mean, when I was in Assam, in Shillong and Meghalaya, 3 young Indians who were transporting an adult female elephant in their back of their truck were arrested and prosecuted because that animal was chained improperly and hadn't been fed or watered properly. And this was front page news all over Northeast India. An elephant. Meanwhile, in the coal fields of Meghalaya or the streets of Mumbai, women are being mistreated in the most awful ways, and minors are dying in the most feudal medieval working conditions. But that elephant and concern about the welfare of that elephant was paramount in that country. And so when people were telling me, well, they have all these regulations and people don't follow them, that's pretty much true when it comes to human jobs, places that employ people. But it's not true on things that Indians really care about, like their megafauna. When I was there, all over the country, tigers were moving beyond the boundaries of their reserves and killing people, lots of people. I mean, there was a tiger in Haryana, no, it was Punjab, that was thought to have killed like 7 or 9 farmers. And the reason that tiger could do that is because they grow a lot of sugarcane there, and it's really thick. And so the farmers are working at the edges, in the open fields at the edges of the sugarcane, and the tigers are coming out and grabbing them and bringing them back. This tiger had killed an enormous amount of people. And the press coverage in India was for the tiger. Not for the folks that were getting eaten, but for the welfare and the well-being of the tiger. That what was going to happen to this tiger? So it's not, so the country has some interesting, very interesting ways of expressing its concerns about the things that it's really, really concerned about.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Carl Ganser, you heard from me, Circle of Blue. I have a question for Diego to take this more to a global perspective. I mean, the gender issues are huge in water, food, and energy, particularly in water around the world, water and sanitation. When we also talk about thirsty energy, this kind of global perspective, we've seen a huge change in the last 3 or 4 years about the understanding of this nexus, and also about the role that gender plays and the empowerment of women in delivering and playing a role in the process of water. Can you talk a little bit more about that in the bigger perspective? What's happening around the world, and maybe how that may or may not influence India?
Yeah, I think obviously for us it's the gender aspects are crucial in all of our development projects, and I can think of two big developments that we're seeing more and more in these fields, and obviously more at the micro operational level. So if you look at some of our work on rural water supply and sanitation, we are targeting a lot of programs in which you basically try to ensure that there are, for example, separation of toilets in schools, no? Because there is clear evidence that when there is unisex toilets in the schools or bathrooms in the schools, there's a decline in the girls' participation in schools. So there are a lot of projects that are targeting those particular aspects. It's the same. Also, we've seen. I was recently in a project, a watershed project in Ximing in China, where basically this was a watershed management project, but we had a particular component to provide some roof solar systems to houses, because the focusing particularly on the women in the households, because it was an issue of just having a hygiene issue of having the capacity to take a bath. No? In some of these rural areas in China, some of these females in the rural areas take a bath every 6 months, no? Because there is no hot water, and then in the winter it gets extremely cold. So what we are trying to look is, in some of these programs as part of Thirsty Energy, when you start looking at solutions, is how do you ensure that the social policies are in place that also target sort of the gender dimension.
Okay, we have time for another question or two. So yeah, go ahead.
Brandon Banner with the U.S.-India Business Council. I just have a question about multinationals, and maybe you could, all three of you or a couple of you, shed light on the role that multinational companies are playing, or should be playing, or ought to be playing in the competition between water and food and energy. Thank you.
Well, when I'm in India, I attended, this last time, I attended an energy conference in New Delhi, in which the global petroleum sector was in very strong attendance. And India's terribly interested in natural gas. India has pretty significant natural gas reserves that can be tapped, but it only has 3,000 kilometers of pipeline. The United States has 500,000 kilometers of pipeline, I think. Our natural gas fracking revolution is in part the result of the fact that we can move that gas around, and we have the capacity to build pipelines in a hurry. And there's $30 billion worth of pipeline construction going on in the U.S. In India, it's a much different regime, both on regulating, encouraging construction, and actually doing the construction. In some measures, because villages are nervous about having new pipelines and moving people around and that kind of thing, the routing, but the other is the technology and the capital. So there was a lot of discussion at that meeting about pipeline capacity in natural gas, and quite a bit of it was led by external corporations. And one of the companies that was in really big attendance was Caterpillar. So, Caterpillar, Peoria-based Illinois company, is just slammed with orders for its equipment across the board. It's agriculture equipment, it's construction equipment, it's engineering prowess, it's design prowess. You go when I travel in Mongolia, in China, in India, Australia, all these places, man, Caterpillar equipment is everywhere. And, so they're intent on expanding their expertise and, of course, expanding their product line. So, I found U.S. and European energy companies all throughout India, or actually all throughout Asia. I mean, everywhere.
I guess I can add, in my experience, what I've found is that the influence is by and large positive. There are multinational companies that are essentially rent seekers and extracting value out of these places. But by and large, what you find most interesting is that if you are on a bus or a train and you start talking to these Indians who are working for these companies, they speak to how their daily exposure and the standards that they're being held to for accountability are so different. We're working for the MNC than the Indian company they worked for prior to that. Their income levels are higher, but also they're getting the idea of social responsibility. It may be whitewashed, but they're at least getting it. And you can see actions that follow. The only depressing thing I saw in that, because there's always got to be a lack of silver lining in these things, is that these multinational companies seem to operate in two frames in a country like India. One is the unit of the multinational company that essentially serves the US or international customers. Those people are being held to outstanding standards for performance. Then there's the unit that performs working with the Indian government or with Indian customers. You see a transference of some of the principles to that group, but they're paid lower. Their standards and everything are quite different.
And, you know, it's hard for multinationals or companies to operate in India because just on electricity availability and steadiness. It's hard to get, it's hard for a GM to have a plant there because the energy sources are so unreliable, and then the response to try to get them reliable is so unreliable and slow. And that's one of the reasons that the GDP in India is slowing, because just availability of power. So when you talk to an American multinational executive, they live like kings in India. I mean, drivers and maids and cooks and all the rest. But at the same time, it's very different in their daily their daily transactional details are so much different, and in some cases, much harder than living here.
And on that note, I should add that there was a lot of hope. I'm sure, Brandon, you're aware of this. A few years back, the U.S. government signed a deal with the Indian government to provide civil nuclear energy technology. And there was a lot of hope that this would really bring a lot of U.S. companies into India. But in many ways, it's been held up because of all kinds of problems, litigation issues, various things that have held up a lot of what could have been tremendous progress and business opportunities for the U.S. So it's an unfortunate case study. Unfortunately, we are going to need to wrap up. Let me just remind, as Jennifer said, Choke Point India does not end today. It's going to be continuing. We'll be taking its act on the road. Keith and I will be in India in a few months, so please do keep in touch. Please take some of the literature outside, and if you could join me in a round of applause, not only for our panel, but also for Jennifer at the Wilson Center, my colleague, and also Carl at Circle of Blue. Thank you. Thank you. We're adjourned.